I wanted to get your assessment of how the switch of Biden for Kamala Harris, how that changes both, the potential trajectory of Israel policy here in the U.S., if it does represent any type of a potential shift. And also, I was curious from your perspective how Bibi Netanyahu may be assessing that switch and how that may have changed his calculus here as well.
Yeah, I think that there is the potential for a change with Kamala Harris. It was quite obvious that Biden, in addition to carrying out a terrible policy, also did not know how to talk about this with any kind of empathy towards Palestinians. It was fundamentally clear.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it's him deeply ideologically from his background or it's his mental decline or whatever it might be, but he always spoke in a very humanizing way about Israelis, utterly dehumanizing of Palestinians, whether you can believe them or their numbers and all that. And it's obvious that it's just empty rhetoric whenever he expresses concern for Israel engaging in indiscriminate bombings or all that. It did not have any emotional content behind it. He did not speak with any real or meaningful empathy. And on top of that, repeated every Israeli lie about Palestinians, whether it's the 40 beheaded babies. He claimed he saw the pictures of them. That was an Israeli lie about what took place on October 7th, about the Hamas headquarters being under a hospital. All that stuff was stuff that Biden was willing to endorse. And the only meaningful shift that we've seen so far between Kamala Harris and Biden is that Kamala seems to appreciate the magnitude of the crimes that Israel is committing.
Yeah.
And even though she's not offering a different policy, she's speaking about it with greater empathy. She is talking about how utterly unacceptable it is that people are behaving in that fashion, the fact that so many Americans of Palestinian origin are losing family members and how devastating that is and how it desperately needs to come to an end immediately. She's able to express some more empathy, but whether that's just campaign rhetoric because they look at the polls and they see how deeply a problem it is, or whether Kamala Harris is actually interested in a meaningful policy change is something that remains to be seen. And I think that just the fact that it's not Biden on the ballot at this point will bring a portion of progressives who've been deeply troubled by his policy to be able to stomach the idea of voting for Democrats. But it's basically hers to win or lose. And I think it really depends on how she behaves between now and the election and how strongly she signals a major shift in American policy or whether they can even get a ceasefire between now and the election. That could have a very, very significant impact.
So speaking of that tone, we had an instance in Detroit where there were pro-Palestine protesters, and she took a very dismissive, condescending, I'm speaking tone. And there was a backlash to that. Then she goes to another rally. I don't know if this was the Phoenix or the Las Vegas one, where she's again faced with protesters. And she clearly had developed a different strategy to address the protesters. Let's take a listen to how she handled this one.
Which includes respecting the voices that I think that we are hearing from. And let me just say this on topic of what I think I'm hearing over there. Let me just speak to that for a moment, and then I'm going to get back to the business at hand. So let me say, I have been clear. Now is the time to get a ceasefire deal and get the hostage deal done. Now is the time. And the president and I are working around the clock every day to get that ceasefire deal done and bring the hostages home. So I respect your voices, but we are here to now talk about this race in 2024.
All right, so on the one hand, Omar, you have better tone there. You have her comments after her meeting with Bibi Netanyahu, I also thought were, well executed. Yep. You have her choice of Tim Walz over Josh Shapiro. Walz was much more empathetic towards the uncommitted movement. Shapiro, of course, compared Palestinian protesters to the KKK.
Yeah.
So you have that. You have actually a new choice of a liaison to the Jewish community that people were, favorable towards, that seemed to be a positive indication as well in terms of her direction. One of her top policy advisors was more of the Obama School of Foreign Policy, which was, Iranian nuclear deal, a little better on these issues than the Biden foreign policy team has been. On the other hand, even what she says there, that's just the Biden policy. So it's not like we've had any actual concrete indication of a shift. So how do you look at this constellation of events and signals?
She's savvy, right? She watched the backlash to her first reaction to protesters and realized that she had to make an adjustment, and she made it. And I think that the VP pick actually is not that trivial either.
Yeah.
It's funny because both Tim Walz and Shapiro are both your standard pro-Israel Democrats.
Right.
Both of them are kind of soft on accountability for Israel. None of them is eager to cut off military aid or any of that stuff. Literally, the only difference between them is that emotional intelligence on how to address the deep anger among young people in this country about what's happening in Gaza. And in one case, you've got the standard pro-Israel line of Tim Walz, that is, we support Israel, but we understand why people are angry and why this means a lot because the situation is unacceptable. It's, again, just speaking about it with empathy, versus Shapiro, who speaks about it basically like a monster,
right.
just going, dismissing those people and ascribing racist intentions on their part, and basically even suggesting policies that might curtail their free speech. That's
right.
a deep contrast on a domestic level, not on a foreign policy level. And yet you have the entire Republican conversation, again, amplifying the ridiculous charge of anti-Semitism being alive in the Democratic Party and part of this decision. Ironic as hell, given that Donald Trump, nobody comes even close to him in the conversation in terms of anti-Semitic engagements. He accused the American Jewish community of, he keeps saying Israel, your country, as opposed to America being their country.
Right.
In a meeting with Republican Jewish donors, said, you don't like me because I don't need your money. Again, playing into that trope for the idea that you like, I think he may have even said the words, you like to control people, your politicians with your money, and I'm not game for that. This kind of rhetoric from Trump, and the fact that there isn't anybody, when you look at that ticket with Vance, and you contrast it with the Democratic ticket, with Kamala Harris having a Jewish husband, with the Secretary of State under Biden being also Jewish, with the fact that the leader in the Senate is Jewish, all of that, and to still be able to have Democrats panic in reaction to that charge of anti-Semitism, in a way, it's troubling to me. I mean, you should be able to just laugh off that kind of accusation from Republicans and shut it down because it's utterly baseless. It's just on its face the behavior of clowns when they bring that up. And instead, you constantly see this pressure. And my speculation is that the initial bad reaction from Kamala Harris to protesters came on the back end of all that backlash of how come you didn't pick Shapiro as your running mate. And I think she felt the need to compensate there. And at some point, I really wish that Democrats would just develop a backbone and start dismissing bullshit charges that are directed at them and start owning the progressive positions that, again, a lot of it is rhetoric, not enough of it is policy, but at least in positions to advocate for progressive policies in which you treat everybody equally. That's something to be proud of, not something to shy away from. And they have to develop more resilience to the smear machine that we see, especially in relation to Israel, where it's a wedge issue that Republicans constantly use to bludgeon Democrats. And every time they do, rather than own a policy of accountability for Israel, they immediately panic and say, we have to prove that we're more pro-Israel. It's a losing strategy in the long term. We're seeing the beginnings of it. And there's an obvious, demographic shift among young people who see this issue very, very differently.
Right. One of the things that I've seen with regard, to defend Kamala is this idea, well, listen, Biden's the president. She can't really publicly undercut him. Like, she's trying to do her little tone shifts and pick the people that seem to indicate a different direction potentially. And of course, we're very pragmatic about what they're not gonna be where we are, but maybe a little more Obama versus Biden. But she can't undercut Biden, so she can't actually come out and set forth a policy that is different than what he has expressed. Do you think that that's fair, or do you think that she does have some room to set herself apart from his policy?
Yeah, it is. She's in a tough spot precisely because of that. I think that is fair, but it's incumbent on her. There's just the reality that the Israeli policy is absolutely intolerable. It is completely morally indefensible. And yes, you do have the constraints of currently being vice president, serving to a president that feels maybe a little bit differently about this. But it's really on her to draw that contrast between now and the election. It's a dynamic where voters are paying attention and they've lost many of them over this issue. And it's really on her to try to figure out a corrective course. And yeah, she's not in an easy position, but you can't expect people who have been deeply frustrated with this administration and the way that they have dealt with this issue to basically simply be threatened with the prospect that Trump is worse. There's no doubt that Trump would be worse on every issue, including this one, frankly.
Right.
But still, for a lot of people, genocide is a red line. And I think one way that Kamala Harris could potentially do something meaningful is apply internal pressure within the administration right now to get that ceasefire done. And maybe that is something that ends up swaying a little bit more in the Democrats' direction for progressives come election day.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, Omar, my highest aspiration is just that you would have someone who's not ideological on the issue. Biden clearly very ideological. And I think Josh Shapiro also, through his, repeated expressions and the way that he approached the issue, was also clearly very ideological. Because if you have just your sort of replacement level Democrat, they can read the polls and see that this policy, forget about, I'm not counting on their morality, right? Mm-hmm. They can see this policy has been politically disastrous for them and created this potential, massive war, which would be even more politically disastrous for them. So my highest aspiration is that in Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, you just have two people who are not ideologically committed to the issue, who see Bibi as the partisan, far-right, fascist figure that he is, who wants to elect Donald Trump, by the way, and can read the polls and respond to the pressure and realize that this is a politically foolish direction because, as I said, I'm not counting on anyone's morality here winning the day.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think, in a way, Bibi Netanyahu is paying attention to the fact that this is the trend. It's escalating pressure, way too slow for my taste. I think you should have pulled the plug on genocide from day one.
Right.
But Netanyahu is noticing the fact that there is growing frustration in the Biden administration, and which is why he's pushing for this regional war to blow things up. And it's not surprising that it came on the back of his visit to Washington, by the way, that he did the bombings in Beirut and Tehran. You wonder what conversations may have been had with the Trump team while he was here, because he did actually meet with Trump as well.
That's right.
And it seems like the Republicans seem to think that for things to blow up, this rhetoric from Trump has been all in the direction of, we have all this chaos in the world because of Biden, and if I'm in power, then I'm going to restore peace and order and all of that. You can't believe a word of what Trump is saying, but nonetheless, if he can demonstrate more chaos in the world while Biden is still president, that's a strategy that Republicans think play in their favor, and it seems to be one that Bibi Netanyahu is running with. And here's the insane part, is that after those provocations and the prospect of regional war expanding under Netanyahu, what did Biden do? He released the 2,000-pound bombs he's been withholding from Israel in preparation for that regional war. So in a way, the lesson for Netanyahu is the more you escalate, the more you're going to get the Biden administration to bend for what you want.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a dynamic. It's precisely what you said. We have to understand that Netanyahu is interested in electing Trump. And if Democrats are serious about not allowing, not to be taken advantage of in this case, you need the backbone to do not a cosmetic shift in policy, but a meaningful shift in policy. And it's just having the foresight. Politicians are by nature risk averse. It's all about status quo is how I got here, and you need to stick with the status quo to remain in power. But something is happening in the world that is a very, very significant major shift. And either you adapt to it or you keep your head stuck in the sand until you pay the consequences and lose over it. And this to me is a wake-up call of reading the room, looking at what's happening in the world, and understanding that if there was ever, it's always been the morally correct position to have a major shift in American policy and to stop treating an apartheid regime in Israel like it's above the law and above the rules. But right now, that's a political necessity as well. And the question is the Democratic Party going to wake up to that shift and the fact that it is a domestic political necessity as well at this point, rather than just a strategic and a moral imperative?
All very well said. And Omar, always grateful to have your time and your expertise. So thank you for coming in this morning.
Thank you very much.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.